Thanks all of you for coming. We're very lucky to have Professor Darshini Mahadevia here, one of the foremost planning scholars in the country. Professor Darshini Mahadevia teaches at the Faculty of Planning at the CEPT University with over 20 years of teaching and research experience. She specializes in research on urban development policies, including housing policy, urban poverty, human and gender development. In particular, her research is focused on inclusive urban planning. She has published 13 books, booklets, discussion papers, 73 articles in books and journals besides newspapers and website articles. Her latest publication is Handbook on Urban Inequalities, co-authored with Sandeep Sarkar and published by the Oxford University Press. In 2009, she started the Center for Urban Equity based in Ahmedabad, Ahmedabad, of which she is still a director. The CEU functions as the National Resource Center for Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation with the Government of India. She also was a member of the Technical Group for 12th Plan for Urban Housing Shortage in India, 2012. And also the Sabarmati Riverfront Project Rehabilitation Monitoring Committee for 2011. So without much, to Darshini, thank you. Let's all welcome Darshini.
Thank you, Jairaj. And I'd like to thank IIHS for this invitation to speak here. They asked me what I would like to speak on. And so I just said that I like to speak on something that I've been very confused about working, and especially the confusion got heightened when I was the Dean of Faculty of Planning at CEPT University. And there have been this confusion as to what we are doing in this professional space and running the professional program. So this is a presentation that is sort of aimed at bringing some clarity to me, but I thought I might like to share here with a larger audience on this planning conundrum in India. It's also part of an ongoing research that we are looking at as to how do we change planning curriculums on bringing the Indian reality onto the center stage, which is called building inclusive communities. But I think, and we've been thinking for quite some time as to we need to look at what urban planning is and how do we sort of respond to the challenges that we have currently in our cities, and the challenges are going to increase more if we are not going to address them. And in that case, how do we relook at what the profession has come from, where it has come from, where we are, and where do we move from here? And not the final slides does suggest where we are from, where we can go. I mean, obviously this is not the final answer, and it's just the ideas to be tested and through discussions. I think all of us we know about the urban situation and cocktail that we have of all kinds of situations that we have. We do this exercise with our students when they come first and ask them that what is it that you have seen in Ahmedabad? And the first answer that comes up is all related to traffic issues. I think for middle class, urban traffic congestion and issues are very big issues that immediately strike you when you go to a city. We see there's 57,000 people who have died from road accidents in Indian cities in 2015, according to the official data. The mess that we have is known, the congestion that we have, but this is when we try to do something new, and this is the story of the Ahmedabad BRTS that you see here. This is the BRTS stand, and it's Ahmedabad BRTS is a segregated lane in the center of the city. It's not high-speed bus system that Delhi has done. And I think there's been no control. All vehicles have entered into the BRTS lane in Ahmedabad today. So instead of this becoming a solution to the problem, it's increase and enhance the problem. And one of the high rates of accident is BRTS itself in Ahmedabad city, the way it's governed. And the planning also has deficit because BRTS has been, as we do with many of our urban projects, that we pick up the ones that can brand the city, but we do not do the peripheral and other supportive or collateral planning exercises that we need to do along with it. So it stands in the middle of it at the envy of people who are stuck in the traffic here, and so you finally have encroachment. So this has become the fate of the Ahmedabad BRTS in many segments now today. And increasing motorization as our national economic directions are going, we're going to see a slow death of the system that we have created. Along with the BRTS, you can anyway, this is another picture, but along with the BRTS, we thought we are going to do a non-motorized transport infrastructure, because they are all feeding into eventually the BRTS system. This track has been done, very few users are there because of its own badly designed system, and these tracks are only there, I think, on 25 to 30% of the BRTS tracks, and there's no footpaths that's to take care. So it's not been seen as a holistic system that is added to the chaos that we have on our streets. I think even in Bangalore, when there is this metro system, I think we have not done anything to integrate the metro with the pedestrian and other infrastructures that go, they should have been going along with it. On the water front, we have actually much greater problem that we see. We know that water lines are polluted, are not, low-income settlements are not having water, etc. And so all the case studies that we have done do indicate some of this situation. These are some of the field works that we have done and collected photographs of the situation. National Sample Survey latest data on housing of 2012 tells us that 5.2% of urban households have shifted to buying bottled water in our cities, and that's the trend coming up. There's a big argument on this, that should city governments be providing drinkable water through this network, so they could be providing water for domestic use and people can buy drinking water. That's an open sort of debate that is still pending. One doesn't have an answer. But the situation, this is study from our fieldwork study, and the situation is troubling when we have planned housing developments, and this is the BSUP's redevelopment site in Ahmedabad, which is on the urban periphery. And on post-rehabilitation, one were expecting, and a lot of rehabilitation studies tell us that infrastructure improvements have happened, especially water sanitation has happened in the sites where people have lost their livelihoods being relocated on the rehabilitation sites. But that's not correct. Even infrastructure situation is abysmal. And water has, this is Vatwa rehabilitation site in Ahmedabad. Those who know it, it's on the periphery. And what you find is water has become a big issue for local everyday conflicts in this rehabilitation site, the way the quality of infrastructure is and the way the governance of water is there. Partly it has to do with the rehabilitation process itself, because people from different slums were brought together on a site. So there is no community cohesion. There is no social network that has happened. And all of a sudden from the top, a Resident Welfare Association was thrusted and 2 NGOs were mobilized to say, as an afterthought, that you run the Resident Welfare Associations on the sites. And so the result is that there is no coordination among the water provider and this. There are water tanks and the community is organized around one Resident Welfare Association, around one water tank. And that's not working. There is no coordination between this apartment and this apartment. So there is fights along with it. After a while, the municipal corporation passed on the management of the water system to the community itself. And they are left with, they are not paying money, they do not have money to pay. When the system breaks down, there's nobody who, I think this is a lot of this we see in our own normal, even middle class residential neighborhoods, of not being able to come together on common issues. And here the situation is worse. This is a peripheral informal settlement on Ahmedabad, and this is a regular site of water. On this side, we have another issue. It's that because the municipal, this is an informal settlement, so municipal government has not provided drinking water. This is the Bombay Hotel area. which I was talking in the previous class, which is also, it's also known because it's a large Muslim ghetto that has come up post 2002 communal violence. And so we have non-state actors which have entered into the water system, which we call water mafias, that have come up. And there is coercive practices of the water mafia with regards to collection of charges. There is territoriality and fights among various water mafias. And I think when we look, on one hand, I think there's informal settlements are answers to urban problems. But on the other hand, given this services availability and governance of them, a lot of them being passed on to the non-state actors, and we call them non-state actors, whether the national government calls another kind of people as non-state actors. I mean, these are really, the women get terrorized and threatened by these providers of water, and so there is so much of this gangs and water mafia operating today in Ahmedabad because of the lack of water facilities available. So what we sometimes notice is in the municipal figures, the number, the certain percentage of people don't get water, but what behind that, the story and everyday life of people is a lot of conflicts and tensions and violence that exist in some of these informal settlements. Somewhere people do come together to build this, as this is a case study of Guwahati, where Unnayan Samitis are all widespread, finding answers to. So they are just collecting money and laying, because this absence of government in some of these pockets. Often this leads to a situation like this, where protests are there, they go, and then I think there have been a lot of protests, there have been breaking of municipal offices, violence, counter violence by the people not having water. This rarely gets media coverage, but this did get coverage in 2014. This housing colony is next to this. Well, after a long time, I was passing by this road, and you see this mountain. Ahmedabad is a flat plain. And we pass by and see a mountain, one wonders, what is this? This is a garbage mountain. City's garbage, it's called Pirana dumping site. And this residential colony has actually come up adjoining it, the Bombay Hotel area that we are talking about. So there has now a big PIL, and we often say that Ahmedabad, at least we've been a lot of studies in the city. A lot of policy moves in the city have happened through public interest litigations. It's not, and so there is what the current government might say judicial overreach or judicial activism in the executive sphere. But that's how some of the policy actions have happened in the city. Sanitation is in large parts, and I think Bangalore would also have large parts of the city of having this kind of situation. Mumbai has the whole huge part of eastern Bombay is this kind of situation that you see. And on top of it, now what we're going to get is climate change related issues and frequency of floods, the severity of floods even is going to increase. Ahmedabad, I think this we know, but what we saw last time is extreme heat situation in the city in localities where temperatures had crossed 50 degrees centigrades. These are local heat island effects, but this is what we are going to expect in the longer run. So what the city has a heat action plan. You can see this has been released by the municipal government. But the heat action plan is only emergency warning system. It's not going all the way to relief or even resilience building. And so we saw last summer an increase on an average 8 degrees centigrade in some parts than what we had normal temperatures. I mean, Bangalore case, I don't need to tell you. This is something that we found in Guwahati, where we have been doing. There is this Ramsar site called Deeporbil. It's a very large lake. But you see that there's a railway line passing through the lake. You have this municipal government itself dumping garbage in the Ramsar site. While housing encroachments by the low-income households have not been permitted. As a result, Guwahati has seen since last about a decade or so very strong housing rights movement led by Akhil Gogoi, KMSS as an organization. There have been, while we were doing our field work, there was, at that time itself, there were demolitions of some of the settlements from the banks, as well as what we have is the hill settlements like this, on which largely tribal communities have moved. So if you look at the notice, there is this tension around land rights between the immigrants or migrants from Bangladesh, and it's very difficult to identify who is a Bangladeshi Muslim and who is a local Muslim. And so there has been this festering tensions over, the Bodos fighting in Kokrajhar areas, and there's a very, very violent struggle. So that gets then implanted, the struggles and conflicts get implanted on the city, and when there is this selective action on ecological fronts by the city government, then conflicts escalate. And so when we were there, there was this struggle of, there were protest march, there were firing, and finally a call was given by the leader saying that if we are not giving land pattas by so and so dates, we will self-immolate ourselves. And there was self-immolation. I'm not showing the picture. One of my research assistants was there who took picture of what was going on. So it can escalate to conflicts of such kind and deaths if we are not going to be able to handle this issue. Further ecological hazards, so this is housing condition on the hills, and you see very frequent landslides and deaths in this part of the city. Historically, the way the city has developed, the tribals who were original settlers on the mainland have moved up into the hills, and they are called illegal settlers on the hills and forest lands. And so it's also now seen as tribal versus non-tribal issue in Guwahati city. In Assam, it's really a big issue of inflection on these issues. What I'm trying to say is that we're moving into a phase and situation where there are multiple sort of conflict points and inflection points, and there's no one simple answer to large number of our cities that we have. While we were doing our city study, that's another situation that we came across, and I spoke about it in the previous class, that this is, and we think that land is the genesis, an urban land is the genesis for all the conflicts that we see in our cities. This is an informal settlement that I was talking about, which is called Bombay Hotel area, where we have done a case study for over 2 years and know the locality very well. We find that informal developments, answers of large number of people who are unable to purchase land in the legal markets, land markets, and especially last 20 years, economic reforms have led to speculative land prices. And in that situation, people do, and this is also a large area because that's where the Muslim populations have resettled after 2002 violence. This is the living conditions that you have. There is a land that is belonging to a farmer which has been subplotted in this manner. And so you have actually a plan of the locality, of a housing colony, which is informal development, is subplotted like your plotted development here, but this is just that there is no clearance taken on agriculture permission. Non-agriculture permission has not been taken, the building permissions have not been taken, the master plan regulations are not met, and so in that sense it's informal. People have evidences of the money that they have paid. There is documents that they hold, they think that is their ownership rights, but it is still an informal, illegal land ownership that they have. Now in this situation planning, the city government decided to implement the plan there. Now Ahmedabad has a planning mechanism called town planning scheme. which is called TPAs, Town Planning Scheme. The Town Planning Scheme, for those who are not familiar, is a mechanism in which when the plan happens about the local area, that's a zonal plan as one would think in case of Delhi, 40% of the land is taken by the planning authority for public purposes and 60% returned back to the original owner. Now, when that begins to happen when already developed situation, then you have trouble. And so this is the trouble, that this is already a dense settlement on which they have now done the town planning scheme. So they have superimposed that on the existing development, and they've identified housing for socially weaker sections, for schools, for hospitals, so that's all marked out. But there are actually people living here, the 25,000 households that are living here, and that we see that the whole development has come through this sort of informal planning. So at 25,000 households is like 150,000 people living there. What do you do with it? And so the bureaucratic planning mechanisms that we have, I've deliberately brought this case because there is this big ho-ha and brouhaha about TP scheme as a mechanism and answer to urban planning problems. But it's not an answer in such a situation, because inevitably in all our cities planning, I don't know about Bangalore, but many of the cities planning comes after real estate has already developed the areas, or informal developments have already occurred, and planning is an afterthought that comes in. Now planning is required because informality has limits. If there is no planning mechanism comes in, then you are not able to get in municipal water and sanitation systems. So that the government doesn't come to the locality if planning doesn't come. But if government comes to the locality, then inevitable demolitions happen, because now these sites have to be vacated for public purposes. And here there was about 10% of households were to be demolished, and there was a huge hue and cry and mobilization on this issue. Now, this is one of case we have studied, but if you look at all the urban peripheries in all cities in India, including Delhi, where you have informal peri-urban developments, what do we do? Is current planning mechanism that we think is called planning, and we have master plans, etc., adequate, or suitable, not adequate, but suitable for the situations that our cities have? In Guwahati, this sort of demolitions led to huge mobilization, a web of violence and counter-violence. We have written a paper on this, which is going to come out on February 18th, review of urban affairs issue of the EPW. So I think the story of this whole movement has been written up there, and you might find the detailed of what happens. And so this is the person who, this is Akhil Gogoi, this is the person who immolated himself while we were there. I have, as I said, so now what happens? After that, our study ended. There have been ongoing negotiations of giving pattas in Guwahati. So I don't know, that's now, we don't have, our research has ended, but there's part two to it, and somebody needs to follow this up as to what is happening in terms of giving of pattas. There are also conflicts on the streets in terms of land access. The Street Vendors Act that the national government has framed, and which all cities have to be sort of adopting, says 2% of land need to be given for street vending. Ahmedabad, they began to implement that. The implementation then started, and there was a High Court order again, which says that the city government, Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, should make a scheme for the implementation of this legislation. So the scheme has been made in such a way that it will lead to eviction of 65% of the street vendors. Because planning does not have any tools available, legal tools available to adjust this. And this is Guwahati, where you find then people fighting with each other on a daily basis for access to land. And these fights in Guwahati are on ethnic grounds, there are fights on religious grounds, and so on. So you do find that this frictions and social tensions in our fragmented society then gets implanted onto all other tensions that exist on account of planning and non-planning situations that we have. So when we have a situation that this cocktail can become lethal if these challenges are not going to be addressed and accepted and addressed, and they do tip into violence. We just completed a research on violence in cities, and we see that there is this everyday sense of violence in the lives of people that if they're not addressed, they do tend to escalate into much larger conflicts. The research on cities and violence largely as an idea comes from Latin American context, where this country, there are very high homicide rates. India does not have very high homicide rates, but it has this everyday violence in the lives of the people, particularly poor, where the state itself is a perpetrator of violence. Through some of this practice in urban planning becomes a very large tool for perpetration of everyday violence in people's life. A very legalistic view of how city planning should happen, and that's what I think I've been taught as an urban planner when I was studying, and unfortunately, we are still teaching the same thing to our students as to what is urban planning, and it finally comes to statutory plans. And when you address urban issues through only the statutory lens, that's where a lot of people then become illegal and criminal in planning language. What I think now, post-2000, we see a lot of writing coming from the South, and this is Vanessa Watson's one of the papers. She says that we have multiple rationalities in India. So there's just no one rationality. And those who know planning, emergence of planning professions said that it's a rational way of intervening in urban space. But there is no one rationality, and postmodernism also brings that in a larger argument. There's no one rationality about who will decide, for whom it will be decided, etc. And that yet, these debates remain in philosophical realms, but in the planning profession, yet we have not been able to bring them in and respond to the situation. And so what we have is very different ideas today. We started with ideas about engineers and I think architects talking about what the cities should be. I think a lot of us have been told what the city planning, Corbusier ideas and Ebenezer Howard idea, etc. You have, and so this big noise where different people, I think there is also these days there's a lot of talk about how the planning is only to deal with FSIs and build form and etc. And I think we have a lot of emphasis on this discussion today. There are people arguing about, in addressing the informal sector, you have spaces of protest within the cities, you have economic ideas, entrepreneurship in cities, you have malls, etc. being put as branding the cities, or that's the way forward for the cities. Added challenges is climate resilience. We have women, I think some women's safety in cities and rights to the cities also coming up as an idea, but everybody is talking in their own spaces, and in this way there is no sort of coming together on this discussion, but it just does bring that we have multiple perspectives on what we need to do with the cities, and multiple perspectives coming from multiple segments of urban population of what we need to do about cities. I think some of us are constrained by the demagoguery of the term urban planning. We are having huge resistance. If I would like to talk to Institute of Town Planners India, and there's just complete resistance to moving out of 1960s framework of what planning ought to be. I think here at least you're talking about urban practice, so you're not constrained by this demagoguery, but all others, whatever number, hundreds of planning schools in the country are actually constrained and stuck in this ideology of planning. So I've begun to, so these are the issues that we face day to day. Our students go into the field and look at all this collage of our reality. But once they come back and we want to find an answer, then you find an answer which comes through only master plan. Finally, everything boils down to a master plan, and so urban planning as a profession is actually constrained by its history, and it is in a literal sense, it's a history, which it's a master, a master who's deciding the fate of everybody else. It's not actually, there's no space for her story, that you don't have different viewpoints about what's there, and ideas about cities. It's very masculine as an ideology and an approach which is of totalitarian societies. For the first time, very long back, I think Jane Jacobs have been talking about looking at cities in a very different angle, of looking at life in the cities, and saying that planners should be responding to this reality rather than remaining constrained in this approach to urban planning. Urban planning did come up, and I was very surprised to read that urban planning came up as an urban utopia, and it was the first urban planning exercise where Ebenezer Howard, even to some extent Corbusier or Frank Lloyd Wright, there was this anti-urbanism as an idea in the first urban plans, that everybody wanted to go back to the rural utopia. And so the city plans that were constructed were very much constructed in the image of the countryside. And so it's a paradox that the urban planners were actually trying to create rural fantasia within the cities through the urban planning exercises. Then came a phase where we started looking at rational planning and systems approach to it, and I think this is where we are actually currently in Indian context. We call it comprehensive master plan, where we think we have comprehensive understanding of the city, and that goals and alternatives, etc. Each of them are loaded terms, but we never ever reflected on these terms as to, this exercise that I refer to, and when we ask the students, what do you see in Ahmedabad city, and invariably, as I said, the middle class students coming from middle classes always say a first thing about is transport. And so when we start defining the goals, that itself is where the problem starts, because you're understanding, the looking at, observing of, registering of issues of a city is also very, very caste and also gender specific, and that's where the trouble starts. And so we get, even if we are given a situation of the Indian city as I have shown the pictures, but the final answer that eventually we come here and then don't reflect on how things would be translated in reality. Urban planning history, and ironically, is also located in the polity of social democracy that came up as an idea post Second World War, as a consensus or a compromise, whatever one wants to call, between the left and the right. And I think one of the readings, I don't remember whose it was, it says that social democracy emerged as an idea to halt the march of communism into the Western Europe. So it was a way of bringing sort of what is called mixed economy or welfare systems into the Western Europe, for the Western European countries not to swing towards the left. But that phase lasted up to 1980s, and with the collapse of Soviet Union, there was no pressure on the global system to actually respond, to be concerned about the working classes. And that's the period that obviously we know is the emergence of new right, which is, I find it very paradoxical. I'm amused by the term that planners should be doing what markets require. So I don't really understand, but there is this big talk in literature and in many planning schools also about talking about planners should be responding to the market, but market planning came up as a compromise between the market and the state, and state intervened where markets fail. So that's indeed a sort of a paradoxical situation. I don't know how this is going to be there. And then we find a whole lot of, these are all known diagrams about how then finally it comes to FSI and TDRs and other discussions in planning, but you lose the complete picture of how the city is or how people are living in it, and people become only numbers and FSIs in the planning documents. In many, I was reading literature from UK, and where the author says that in spite, and I think to some extent we see that even in here, that in spite of this Thatcherism coming and this whole push towards right and asking for liberalizing lot of regulatory mechanism for markets to operate, the bureaucratized planning orthodoxy did not allow, and the legislative tools that were created and what planners knew how to operate did not allow it to move completely to the right. And we see the same thing here, that our legal tools are not allowing us to move to the right in terms of allowing free market operation in the city in terms of land. Indian polity also is not allowing that complete shift towards right in terms of land markets functioning. So there has been limited success of the idea and project of the new right in the urban planning system. And there have been resistance, protests from the streets, there have been insurgencies, so to say. An interesting insurgency episode has happened in Ahmedabad, where we had, as a part of JNNU-RM, a big plaza called Bhadra Plaza in the center of the city being designed by a famous architect of the city. And so there were about 2,000 vendors in that space who were asked to move so that the plaza could be designed and developed. So the plaza was designed and was developed, and fancy paving patterns and seats, etc. were put in. And suddenly a year after that got completed, I went there and I found double the numbers of vendors in the place and not an inch of plaza remaining as that plaza that was there. And so it's been just completely taken over. And so this idea of building cities with renewals, city renewals through this city beautification projects, etc., that's some places it is succeeding, some places it's not succeeding. And that's where this also project sort of falls through. In between, I think there have been globally in the north number of ideas about what planning should be. It's a course on planning theory that should be taught to our students, where people have been talking about different practices on urban planning, on advocacy planning, radical planning, communicative planning, etc. But we don't see that kind of situation that is happening. But we do find great amount of resistance is coming on to the official planning practices. And I have just learned today that Bangalore is also having something of that kind. I don't know much about it, but whatever literature I saw, so it seems to be questioning the Bangalore development plan, a very much middle class engineered or focused activity. I mean, I'm now getting interested to know what's going what's happening more to it. There's another trend that has happened in planning, and so also in planning school, is fragmentation of planning. Is somebody is only looking at housing, somebody is only looking at transport. And so we have SPA Delhi has specializations in it. We also had specializations. Transport not talking to land use, now transport not talking to environment, housing not talking to transport. So there's siloization of the profession as well that has happened. So what is it that has happened in summary is that we have a situation where we have transplantation of the knowledge from the global north. Firstly, through colonialism and heavy reliance on northern universities for knowledge. Post-colonial transplantation then continues with the new masters of independent nations. So we have new and also new colonial global financial institutions that are pushing certain agendas. India emerged in the emergent democracies. The idea was that we were supposed to be social democratic countries, but in essence, in practice, that didn't happen. There are different opinions on India's growth path. One of them has been, and that's a very Marxist analysis of Indian situation, that 1945 there was a Bombay plan. The industrialists got together to argue that there should be state subsidized and supported infrastructure, basic infrastructure projects like railways, electricity, etc. And so they did get subsidized, and you see that reflection on the cities, that state did come in to put in infrastructures, but that got located, and there was a selective way the state came in and invested in infrastructures. And the state is not as benevolent as it comes to the poor as it is benevolent when it comes to the elites and the middle classes. So the state, however, kept itself off, and what I think Solomon has called occupancy urbanism, or what in political science we call accommodative state. It allowed people to be there in the cities, building, finding their own devices to create their own lives and mobility. Post-reforms, when land markets expanded and there was a possibility of making a kill in the real estate market, that's where major displacements have begun to occur. And JNNURM has just enhance the displacements that you see in urban space. Even then, I think the low-income populations are coping and subverting the systems and finding some spaces. But those kind of either fights have become, there's limit to the way informal sector would be able to find spaces. So it might work in some places in certain ways, but some places they might be pushed. And the rehabilitation example that I've given is actually completely pushing out the settlers of the riverfront onto urban periphery in all its sense, that they're out of the livelihood labor market, they're out of accessing services, they're accessing schools, health facilities, even transportation services are poor, and so that's how they've been completely marginalized in all its sense. So that has also happened simultaneously, and that process has enhanced much more. And urban planning firstly it was controlled and captured in less ways by the upper classes and caste, and now in the more sense you have cities segregated on caste and class line. I mean, Ahmedabad is a completely segregated city. By south and southeastern part is the Muslim concentration area. 50% of the Muslim population of the city is living there, and that has gradually happened. And so it's not that only economic reforms are sort of to be blamed. These processes have started much before economic reforms, or what we would call unleashing of the right forces that has happened in India. So what do we do if we want to look at urban planning in such a context? And these are just broad ideas. We need to unbundle it and think urban planning as a democratic space-making activity rather than a master planning for cities. It's planners, and not to look at planners as sole agency of providing alternatives. There could be plural perspective and plural plans. There could be government. We don't have implementation of 74th constitutional amendment, but that could have given us an invited spaces of participation to the extent possible within the cities. But if not, if we could legitimize invented spaces of participation, but there is also need for negotiables within the city as to on issues of ecology, climate proofing, housing and transport issues. There has to be a minimum rights on this issue. World Habitat 3 that happened in Quito recently, there is this discussion on bringing the aspect of re-establishing social value of land, because it's from here that the issues start. That if land is privately owned, and you have on one hand capitalism where land is a commodity and doesn't only has an exchange value, you're not going to be able to make that accessible to everybody. We need a welfare state, but not the patron-client relationship, but a different form of deepened democracy kind of a state. Then urban planning. So do we have this kind of practices to be integrated in the urban program? And this is very much for my institution, I don't know here, is that instead of creating planners which are comprehensive master planners or technocrats who are transport planners, etc., could we think of new categories of planners that you're designing social space planners or community planners or planning manager planners, negotiator who are negotiating and so on. I mean, this list is just a suggestive list of what we could do in the planning schools and there's a dire need to move out of what we have been doing, which unsuccessfully for 67 years or more in the urban planning discipline. Thank you.
Thank you, Darshini. Thank you very much. Amazing talk. It's so spot on. To understand the urban crisis, one has to go to understanding the planning, and to understand the conundrum of planning, it's very significant. We go to the history of how we got here. And when we realize what I call the decolonization and democratizing project that is required, which is foundation. So we have another 35, 40 minutes, questions, answers, comments, etc., etc. So there are mics around, and please make sure, raise your hand and the mic will come to you, so that it's live streamed, so it goes on live as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Darshini, for a lovely talk. It was very informative. I had a couple of questions. Towards the beginning of your talk, you talked about, mentioned something about policy being informed by PILs. And I was wondering if you could give us a couple of examples, and broadly, what was the impact on policy of those PILs? Did it drive them in certain directions?
That's a talk by itself. But yes, I would preface that by statement that the experience that I have in Ahmedabad city, because that's a city that I've followed now for many, many years. There is currently an ongoing PIL about implementation of town planning scheme. Now, town planning scheme as a tool is legal tool, and it is a statutory tool, but it's not being implemented. So there is that PIL to ask for its implementation. The rehabilitation for Sabarmati riverfront evictees happen through the PIL. And so while the PIL went on, and as we need, the character of PIL is that the policy unfolds as a part of the process of PIL through various interim orders. Some of the interim orders can be gross orders. That's the downside of PIL as a method, because the orders are given legalistic orders coming from the judges, but given the complexity of the situation, they may not be nuanced understanding of the real situation. So for example, in Sabarmati riverfront rehabilitation, the last order that came from the Gujarat High Court, and where the Chief Justice of Gujarat High Court it was his bench that was giving this, which was hearing this PIL. He said that I would want the riverfront to be cleared by so-and-so date, and that I will want everybody to be rehabilitated by so-and-so date. But the Gujarat High Court is not aware of the complexity of rehabilitation process, about which I spoke for 45 minutes today to the students. It's a very, very complicated process. And so it's the whole rehabilitation. So now if there is going to be another rehabilitation situation, then this becomes a precedence case, and the policy on rehabilitation gets written up. It's not written up, but there will be similar, it will be followed in the same process. Street vendors legislation has come, it should have come. We know that certain percentage of population in our cities are dependent on street vending. And cities, we are going under urban transformation where manufacturing is moving out of the cities and cities are getting into tertiary employment. So there are, so the street vendors in Ahmedabad were former textile mill workers in the organized sector. So they found space in this sector to, so the street vending policy comes through a civil society action at the national level and eventually becomes a bill. One was lucky that it becomes a bill and an act, but in other it may not happen now to be able to make that act. So there is on setting up of common effluent treatment plants in state of Gujarat. It comes through High Court action. And so there are multiple such examples where executive should have acted, and that executive not acting for various reasons that all of us know, that finally the citizens have this right to public interest litigation, either PIL or writ petitions. I think I was told that here in Bangalore you're going to ask for implementation of 74th Constitutional Amendment Act. Now it's a constitutional act. If you know history of PILs in India have been implemented for right to life. That there have been killings by the state of the citizens of the country for which PILs initial 1970s. It started in the time of emergency, and then so rights of the people to live, right, Article 21 of Indian Constitution, right to life, has been so. That's the status that we are. So a lot of our policies do in Ganga Action Plan has been written through a PIL. It's an outcome of a PIL. So we do see that in Gujarat, in urban space, we find some of these new policies that have come in this have been through the PIL mechanism. But then, as I said, that then they become gross action. Now PIL had a successful disposal, for example, in Ganga Action Plan, where is Ganga clean today? Because then they will, the order is given, but to keep the Ganga clean, you need sewerage plants, sewerage systems in all the towns that are along the Ganga. Does this town have financial capacity, or is anybody funding the sewerage networks in these cities? And so judgments can come, but you need to have backup governance mechanism, financial capacities, governance capacities in the cities to be able to do that, and that opens up the Pandora's box on urban governance. Are cities in charge of their own fate, etc.? So if you look at municipal budgets, you see that their own capacity to raise funds through property tax, etc., and nowhere is going to go beyond 25 to 30% in the municipal budget. So how are cities going to be taking decisions about their own destiny? So thus the PILs and the judgments from High Courts and Supreme Court are aware of such a situation. They may be aware, but what would they do? So there is a limitation. It flags an issue, but there requires to be a great follow-up to build pressure on the government to implement eventually whatever is the judgment of the, or final judgment of the PIL, etc. So in Sabarmati Riverfront, finally, with all the good wishes of the Chief Justice of Gujarat High Court, about 2,000 to 3,000 houses, we don't know the numbers. These are all numbers depending on what you define as a household, have been left out of the rehabilitation in spite of the best favorable judgment that one could ever get in this case. And that the rehabilitation that has been given has disrupted lives very badly. So there are two stories in a PIL. I mean, it's good case law gets written through the PIL, but the implementation side, it's not necessarily that the outcomes that we desired are the outcomes that have happened.
Yeah, thank you for such a great insight into the kind of, I guess, potpourri of things going on. I had a question regarding regional planning. So we focus more on the city and the inner city or the municipal limits. But do you see a need for also looking at the region per se as the city start growing beyond its defined boundaries, and even the surrounding areas start growing themselves too, and sort of it forms a urban fabric which is not defined exactly by what is on the paper on the city boundary.
Historically, region plans came in with natural region-based planning, Damodar Valley regions and so on. So there was a sense of natural region from where this planning occurred. The metropolitan regional planning is what is more complex, and it's to do with the systems in which we have, how does the city's boundary expand? And it's all cities, because the land markets are privately managed and there's a lot of manipulation that happens in land markets. And a typical case, not just here, but it's the case of many countries. I mean, I was hearing what French scholars speaking about how developments happen in cities in France, that he said a big developer decides to buy up a land far off and then pressurizes the government, happens to be close with whatever politicians or so on, to pressurizes the government to put in an infrastructure there, so the land prices go up. This is very much a phenomena in many cities, and Indian cities and Bangalore, and this whole story about the Bombay International Airport, of why so far located, etc., is a situation that it's guided by interest other than the larger common goods interest or larger public interest. Regional planning has followed the city planning, and so what has happened is entities like BDAs or Ahmedabad Urban Development Authorities. So development authorities are an afterthought given this situation of sprawl that's happening in the cities, to be able to look at it holistically. So in a limited sense that will work, but regional planning should be essentially, I mean, I think regional planning, what we do in planning schools is, it's not we should be doing, it's an economic planning exercise of deciding how the entire, whatever you define as region, is going to move. And so in response to that, how the infrastructure has to be provided and how the broad activity as to this could be industrial area and so on. So larger land use is decided. Beyond that, regional planning does not have, but because there is a vacuum, given that city boundaries expand after the development has already happened. And so this is a convenience or arrangement of convenience for having these regional planning authorities. But it could be, I think, if I'm correct, in China, that they define the city boundary which is much larger. And the city government has jurisdiction over a larger area which is called city boundary. They were called earlier prefectural cities, but now they're called cities. And then there is an urban area within it. But the municipal government has control over the city boundary. If we were to draw a parallel here, that it could be the boundary of a district or a taluka. And that is the city government. And so the municipal areas, depending on the requirement of land, expands. But it's a planned system and there is a way to control things. It works there. But when private land markets work in capitalist systems, that's hard to do. But if we could have entity which has legal possibilities of controlling larger domains within which the cities are there. So barring, let's say, Delhi, Bombay, which go across districts, Chennai, they move across districts, a large 4 or 5 cities. For other cities, it's possible to have entities which is beyond the city boundary, but it's a statutory entity. And at this moment, we have district planning committees or district planning boards that could be made into statutory entities to look at the whole district, and then it might be easier to do that sort of regional plan for a city which is located within.
Sorry, can I just intervene? Sorry, I forgot to mention. Can you introduce yourself before you ask a question or a comment or something? That'll be great. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Ashwin. I'm doing some work with Alternative Law Forum. I was interested in hearing your thoughts around, as you mentioned, the 74th Amendment is, in many places, particularly in Bangalore, activism first and forefront of many people's minds in terms of a vision. Then you were also talking about things around invented spaces and those kind of things. And I was also quite interested in what you were talking about, how urban planning came as a compromise with the perhaps more radical ideas of the left. So in that vein, a couple of connected questions. I was wondering if leftist places, in your understanding of the history there, had moved beyond, or had imaginations beyond urban planning, and if so, kind of what were they? But sort of more importantly, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what you feel are the limitations of the 74th Amendment, like a fully implemented 74th Amendment, and for instance, is that an inadequate struggle, and if so, why so?
I think globally, in terms of urban governance or any national governance, we are struggling with a reality where inequalities have expanded. And that in the unequal systems, to get this participation of different groups itself is a big challenge. For example, in Paris, and look at USA, you have middle USA and the other USA, there's a disjuncture of the way they look at the country. There are problems of the way the economic systems have moved globally. And so in our cities also, given the high inequalities, even if we were to implement 74th constitutional amendments, there are challenges. And city like Bombay, which has one of the highest inequality, I think would be one of the most unequal, or maybe Delhi, which is the most unequal city of India today. How are we going to have a participation or a forum where Mukesh Ambani and a slum dweller sits together to come to a compromise? Would that ever happen? And so 74th Amendment itself, even if done and implemented, is limited by existing inequalities. And so how does one get around that? So as whatever participatory experiences that has been documented, and there's now research on it, a lot of it is, and I'm not saying that it's not worth, I mean, there is no worth of it. A lot of it is coming from the middle classes, and I think people have written about middle class activism. But at least there is that challenge to the state. We still don't have, to my knowledge, forums where middle class activism extends to include the informal sector and the residents of the poor neighborhoods. Because often there are conflicts that emerge between the poor and the middle class residents in some contexts. For example, this Sanjay Gandhi National Park, where PIL was filed to evict out the encroachers from the Sanjay Gandhi National Park. I have hosts of sort of statements from Guwahati newspapers where a lot of residents who are themselves, but Guwahati city has fully developed through encroachment, and Dakhal, it's called Dokhal in Assamese, is actually a positive word because there's no other way to access land. So middle class housing is, and the minister's housing and everything is on encroached lands. But then you see this narrative in the paper saying that, oh, they are encroaching the streams and they are encroaching the ponds and they are encroaching this, but everybody has encroached in the city. And so there can be contradictions that can emerge in such an unequal society that we live in. But so there has to be conscious efforts from the middle class activist groups who are dealing with planning issues to bring on board and build alliances with people who are talking something else. And especially the lower poor settlements, informal settlements, where there is not much of agency of the poor to be pegging onto the discussions that are happening at the city level.
Implementing what he said about the 74th Amendment, there's also the other contradiction that in a city like Bangalore, 74th Amendment says Metropolitan Planning Committee should do the plan, and the urban local bodies and panchayats in the area should actually do the plan. But we also have a parallel body, the Bangalore Development Authority, which is actually now doing the master plan. Now, there are two planning bodies. So what is your experience? How are they reconciled?
Ahmedabad Urban Development Authority has now, it has usurped the power of Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation to make the plan, city plan. So it is now, they've declared that as a metropolitan planning body. And it's like BDA, Ahmedabad Urban Development Authority. So it has a jurisdiction of larger space, it's a non-elected body. It's the same parallels, MMRDA, and talk about many such authorities. And it by itself doing this non-statutory or parastatals that are going to deliver, and I think Bangalore, this lot has been written on this. I think earlier ones were written by Solomon on this issue of this schism between giving more power to parastatals and then talking about 74th Amendment at the same breath, at the same time. And so powers have been taken away. In any case, urban local bodies don't have powers because they have no financial base. They can't, I think it's here also, but it's about Maharashtra or even Gujarat. We have all the 18 functions vested in the municipal governments, urban local bodies. I mean, you don't call them governments, they are not true sense governments. They are urban local bodies. You have municipal commissioners controlling how this is going to work. So you don't even have any worth of power with mayors, and municipal commissioners have more powers to sanction the budgets than the mayors of the city. All the TP schemes that are made, the development plan are approved by the state government. So where is the authority of the local body? All the Ahmedabad street vendor scheme that was framed after a PIL in the put by a Seva, and the scheme was approved by the state government, not by the municipal body. So where is anyway that power in spite of 75? In Bangalore you have all other parastatals that are all parts of people's life are kind of governed by the parastatals. So, and they are now being treated as special purpose vehicles who need to have financial viability. If that is the case, there is an issue with regards to implementation of. So they've made the 74th Amendment in a way toothless completely. So I think in one of the meeting, O.P. Mathur declared that there is a death of 74th Constitutional Amendment. Especially after the coming of smart cities. It was a discussion, a panel discussion on smart cities, and he said there's a death of 74th Amendment, let us honorably bury it. No, it can't. No, you make it teachless, you keep all the powers with the state government, and you say 74th Amendment is to give more powers to the city, but you don't give legal powers, legislative powers. On what matter does city, urban local body legislate? Does it legislate? No. Does the property tax rates decide by would entry of octroi, or we had octroi tax, I don't know here, but we had Ahmedabad had octroi, and it was 50% of our revenue. We were never asked whether you want octroi or not. The city people were not asked. They removed the octroi, in the same breath expanded the city by 2.5 times. So and half your revenue was octroi. So what happens to the city? The commissioner goes every month with a begging ball to the urban development secretary, please give us money. Now, what's the point in having a 74th Amendment in that? So if there had to be fiscal decentralization and financial powers given to the city, legislative powers given to the city, but that's not happened. So at best you can have area sabhas and little bit of tinkering on symbolic participation. But beyond that, I don't think there is a story, I'm not very familiar, one of my students did this thesis in, say, West Bengal, in Kolkata, because some of these borough committees and their activities came up as an extension of the political movement, and a lot of it was CPM led. So when CPM went into decline and degeneration, these movements also went, but they did at some point in time have political mobilization at the local level. So it was even before 74th constitutional amendment. But there it has to go, I think, in hand with political mobilization. So this is not a technocratic exercise of participation.
My name is Navratin Kataria. I'm a solar and a startup consultant. If you look into a little longer future, do you think there will be a reversal of migration from urban to rural? Specifically, and this time it will be middle class and the people who can afford and who can use technology to do their business or whatever it is. And if that is the case, then don't you think that we have to plan for that development now rather than after the development is begun?
Yes, I like that idea that we have to plan for the next future development. That's what we were expected to be doing. Yes, migration is going to happen. If we see the last census, any urbanization is an outcome of, or urban population increase is an outcome of natural population growth rate within the city, migration, and the third component is villages becoming cities. Now, it is the second component that has dominated the urbanization rate in the 2001 to 2011. So, first time we find that migration defining urbanization. So, we are going to have that, and I would think people like to be in cities. So I was talking to the students, and I myself think, and I've done it myself, that women like cities. It gives them a great sense of freedom from the feudal social and familiar controls, and so on. And Dalits, you ask any one of them, they find it quite, they get a sense of freedom in a relative sense. I'm not saying for what the living conditions in rural areas are. And cities do provide anyway employment opportunities. Agriculture sector is in sort of crisis today, and that's why there's an absurd situation that still people not moving into the cities to the extent that they should be moving, but committing suicides in the rural areas. So there is a pent-up need for urbanization, people moving to the cities. Cities are not providing that opportunities. What do you say, integration, there has been hostility to migrants coming in. If you read at any master plan, master plans have always talked about discouraging city population growth. So, been anti-migrant documents to say. So, but still people have come. So, what have happened is informal peripheral developments that have happened. Slums have developed. 60% of population in Bombay municipal corporation area is living in slums. People make their lives in whichever way, and some of them are interesting. There's an interesting documentary on Dharavi. I think KRVIA people have that. So, I mean, one is not fantasizing informal sector or anything, but people do make their lives, and it's going to happen. Now, which means that you need to have possible planning options, and the best thing is to get low-income housing going. There have been very few episodes in history. One of them was in Alonde's time in Chile, where he that he was killed for that eventually. He was assassinated for that. The government purchased the peripheral land and divided them up to small lots and flushed the market with small lots available for housing development. So anybody who came to the city could get access to these small lots. And so instead of, and these were legal lots, you can, if the state thinks they can provide housing at the available, I mean, that's why land's social value is very important. So it's possible to do that. Rajiv Awas Yojana, which met its death on its birth, I mean infantile death if one were to say, had this idea that we could foresee the term that they was curative and preventive strategies for slums. That is, so slum itself, I mean, the idea there and imagination was that slum is a disease, so you need to have curative and preventive approach to slum. But the idea was that we should have some such small lot provisions on urban periphery, and municipal governments could make provisions for it. The land requirements for this is not very much. 2 to 3% of land would be required in a city for housing the existing slum dwellers. And if low income population is going to move in, you could have additional some of that. So, but that's why the question of land, where is the land going to come from? Now, town planning scheme mechanism does provide land as an idea. In the initial years in Ahmedabad, they were not, but now they are being constructing affordable housing. BSUP housing has been constructed on the lands that the state has appropriated through planning tool. So if there is a will, there is a way, and you can foresee to see where the lands would be required, and you can construct and give options, geographic option in terms of geographic location options. That you don't concentrate them, all of them on city periphery or one side of the city. Today, or the whole SRS schemes in Mumbai are in Ward M, in one part, and so you have done a slum ghetto there. Or what some people call slum special economic zone, or something like that. Don't do that, spread them across. And yes, you can't have then land value capture. You can't have that mechanism for city planning. You need to have a social message, a social value of land attached to it. Do we have, so this, and we can do it because land has been removed from Indian Constitution. We made a change before Urban Land Ceiling Act was promulgated in 1976. Right to property was a fundamental right in Indian Constitution. That was removed. So that today land is in the eminent domain of the state, and the state wishes it can. So the idea is to push state to make such wishes that it provides land for social purposes. If it can provide lands for riverfront development, then why not for slums redevelopment?
Hi, I'm Brinda, an urban planner. I had a specific question in terms of the process of planning and the way you've described it. Did you see in any instance the media playing a role in shaping how planning, either decisions or the process itself, plays out in a city, particularly local media?
There have been more or less near absence of any media coverage on riverfront displacement, for example. So media may, I mean, I think in Bangalore, I was looking at the media articles on the Bangalore development of the master plan resistance that's coming up. Some of it gets covered, but I think it's sort of too cliche to say, but it is a fact that when there are struggles of the urban poor, they don't get as much representation in the media. We had this big coverage when Embark and WRI together had said claiming the streets on Sundays. So you have street festivals on Sunday on some of the important roads. So it did get, because everybody is dancing, singing on the street. But you're not saying that on the daily, everyday basis there is no footpath for a common person to walk. You're not safe on the streets on a regular day. So that doesn't get covered, but this gets covered, and that's one day of celebration on the street has not got translated into widening the footpaths. Recently, because of the congestion, all the footpaths have been cut in Ahmedabad city now. So media does play often a very selective role, sometimes damaging role, has also been played as far as vernacular media in Ahmedabad. We've seen it playing very, very damaging and notorious role when we have communal riots. The media language is in such a way when we read Gujarati papers that you can identify the community of the person who is being talked about. it's written in a particular way. So you know this is being talked about a Hindu or it's talked about a Muslim and so on. So I think there needs to be, so media can obviously play a role, but we know that media is controlled these days. I mean, all these big stories about India, I think you had a media session earlier, and we know that national media, I don't watch any of these debates anymore. I can't tolerate them on the television. Not because Arnab Goswami was shouting, but the views that come up, the limited understanding that is there, there is an engineered manufacturing consensus or manufacturing consent that's going on to some extent. So you see that. That's why I think we have this parallel media where new stories are coming up, and thanks to the internet that's available, the mainstream media, it's very, very difficult. And newspapers, I think, are being run because there is advertisement. So they have to then fill in some gaps by putting in some news. And so it's just basically advertisements, making money through advertisements, and you just put in some news for legitimacy of the newspaper.
Hi ma'am, thank you for the talk. I'm Rishali and I'm a graphic designer, and I'm doing my master's in design from Srishti currently. And I'm working, for my final year project, I'm working with Blank Noise, which is a community which is tackling street sexual harassment. And in your talk, you briefly touched upon the connection between violence against women and urban planning. So I just wanted to know about some projects which are going on to tackle this issue, and what are the challenges that that you're facing in terms of implementation of these plans?
And it's just a new awareness that cities have to be safe for women coming on, especially with after it's got a lot more traction after the 2012 event in Delhi. So we today, I mean, there's this Safe City campaign ongoing, led by Jagori in Delhi. So they've been doing city walks to illustrate to the policymakers what makes difference and so on. But that's to some extent, limited extent of dealing with urban design aspects of the city, of do street furniture, etc. in some way. Then this discourse then leads to surveillance and policing and security measures and CCTV cameras, etc. So it's going into that direction, but the larger structure of the city as to requiring people to commute long distances in transits that are provided by paratransit operators. In many studies, we do find that transport service providers, and that's what's the case also in Delhi, the transport service providers themselves are hazardous for women. They are the perpetrators of violence on women. So, well, except Delhi, I don't know, but this awareness of doing city walks, bringing this issue up is ongoing. We see at CEPT in the last 3-4 years, number of student theses that have been done on women's safety in public spaces and cities. So the idea about that cities are not the same for men and women is coming to fore. And how do we address that needs to be seen. But at least right now we were blind. This modernist idea of everybody, the cities are equal for everybody. Everybody experiences the cities the same way. No, they don't experience the cities the same way. So it's good, at least one step forward. And Jagori has done lots of these training materials, and they would be willing to come to any city. And they've done that in many other cities. And we went to Guwahati to do a study, and one of our component in that study was women's safety in transport. But it was built on the Northeast Network's earlier study on Safe City, Guwahati. And then they gave this feedback into the last state elections that happened. So the study findings and their findings was given as an input to all the political parties' manifestos. So it's there, and it's very endearing to see that suddenly this movement has caught up, and women's movement in that sense is becoming, strengthening, getting stronger in the cities.
You mentioned something in passing. I just wondered if you could elaborate. You said something about JNNURM resulting in displacements. Could you?
Yes,
you
there
elaborate?
is this citizens forum which did city-wise documentation on what has happened. In fact, there is a very interesting saying of then Joint Secretary of Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Elevation, Dr. Mohanty. He says that when initially the JNNURM came, it was called a mission, and it's in common language it was called a mission. He said that wherever we went, and this is especially coming from, and it then led to framing of Rajiv Awas Youth. He said that wherever we went, people were saying, "Arey mission aaya, bhago re bhago, they will demolish us." So all the infrastructure projects have displaced in small lots. For example, BRTS has displaced about 3,000 to 4,000 households in its first phase. Nobody knows about it. Whenever there has been transport projects, street vendors have been displaced because they are, by various legislation, they are called encroachers. Town Planning Act calls them encroachers. Motor Vehicle Act calls them nuisance in legal terms, and so they are encroachers. So they've been all removed. We don't have that, any documentation or even statement in the media or anything about this going on. So they went from city to city, worked with civil society groups to just document them. We have done some documentation of evictions in Ahmedabad city. I hope we are able to bring that out in public domain. So we went out, send our students. They've been displaced due to various infrastructure projects. A lot of that funding has come from the JNNURM. So cities that have got more funding under JNNURM have seen more displacements. And any large event that happens, Commonwealth Games or anything, it does lead to displacement of hawkers from the street and some of the slums.
Role of planning in, you mentioned it in passing, but you haven't really talked about smart city. But what is the connection between urban planning and the concept of smart city, if any?
Urban planning is a legal statutory tool, and that you fix. I mean, it's all countries have seen that. I've seen city plans in China, for example. I was there in 2004 when the decision to decide where the Olympic facilities were to be located in Beijing. I have a copy of the city master plan of Beijing at that time. There's no mention of Olympics in it. Olympics to locate in Beijing is an international level decision to whatever extent. Then in Beijing, where to locate is not taken by the master plan. Beijing had Asian Games, so they had constructed some facilities for Asian Games, and they extended that into Olympic Village. So master plans have not been sites where many of the locational decisions about what happens to a city happens. And in China, because they do things very quickly, in 50-year time, a city, Guangzhou, had made 15 master plans, and now technology permits you to do that. So master plans, in Indian context, you start master plan, that comprehensive master plan, you collect data, and by the time you finish collecting your data, in spite of GIS database and all that, the city has drastically changed because some of the real estate developers have decided to move city in one particular direction. So master plan has no control on anything. So master plan then comes only as a regulatory or control mechanism of what not to do. And so anything that is not mentioned, so now the map I had shown where they have said SEW, socially and economically weaker section housing plots marked on the town planning scheme. But if there is an encroachment on it, they are not going to legalize that. They will evict it and then construct another housing, because this is illegal by the master plan definition. And there is no tool to change the, land uses can be changed in the master plan or town planning scheme or zonal plans, but it has to be approved by the state government, and it can take years to get that done. The town planning schemes, now there is an amendment in Gujarat, but otherwise town planning scheme can get implemented after 10, 15 years. And the developments would not wait for planning to happen and decisions taken. Real estate developers just go on, or informal settlements just come up through various other processes. So then where is planning? It's comes in after everything comes, and so it then comes in as more as a demolisher than actually planning tool.
We have a question from Pune, from the live stream, from Madhav Deshpande. We all agree on the need for slum rehabilitation, and there have been many major attempts to build very low-cost housing to rehabilitate slum dwellers. Why did these attempts fail? Is there a learning?
Why did it?
Why did these attempts fail? Is there a learning?
Pune is not that bad example. Pune has that Yeravada area where they have done in situ redevelopment through community participation. But these are rare instances. Or else you have slum redevelopment schemes like Bombay. I don't know the latest, but 10 years back when my student was looking at it, only 3% of the existing slums were covered, and I think it could have maximum gone to 6 to 8%. It would not have covered. He saw the geographic location of the SRS schemes in Bombay. They were within a kilometer distance of the railway line. That's where the land market is buoyant, and you could use land market to do that. So that was one approach. In Ahmedabad, we are doing SRS now. We have 570, roughly 570 slums. Only 11 projects have been approved. Now, when are we going to reach that 570? So, if you're going to depend on only one mechanism of doing it, it's not going to work. So, what we thought that we will build BSUP, but BSUP as a housing project was hijacked for rehabilitation purposes in many places. And so that's not work. It's not that it's not work. Slum networking program to some extent in Ahmedabad, where 60 slums were covered under that, it did work, but there was no real estate or contractor lobby that was benefiting out of that project. So it got stopped. There has been big fights in the slums where SNP was ongoing. The contractor lobbies would go and contact the councillor and say, but what is there for us in this? Because the community purchases the construction materials, community monitors the construction. So we have never made any slum rehabilitation sincere efforts in spite of everybody shouting. I think that's late 1980s, we had this housing rights movement. Now, idea is not new. Many countries have also done it, but we have not pursued that. Where is the housing policy and housing investment? We've been calling slums as and covering them under Slum Clearance Act. Slums to be addressed under Slum Clearance. The term itself is Slum Clearance. It's not Slum Development Act. And there is no Slum Development Act as even now, in spite of BSUP framing. Rajiv Yojana didn't pick up. And after that, we moved back to same SRS model. I don't know what, I'm not tracked what is happening under affordable housing. But a lot of the affordable housing scheme that are being come up, they're saying 80 square meter housing units. Now, is any one of us in an apartment in city in this professional class also living in 80 square meter housing? We are having houses which is 50, 60 square meters in Mumbai and Delhi and so on. So who is that 80 square meter affordable housing household? 25 lakhs, 15 lakhs is the affordable housing. It's not there. They need to have either lands being given, sites and services we tried for a while. Chennai had that, two Arumbakam and one more, two sites, very large sites, but that's not been. Mumbai had Charkop sites and services. Slum upgrading under the World Bank funded schemes have happened. It's World Bank that has pushed us to do things. Our government has not pushed us and never taken anything. Gujarat, we had never had any low-income housing till there was a need to rehabilitate people and the BSUP happened. So it's wrong to say that why it has failed. It's not even started.
So there's one last question there.
Ma'am, do you see the affordable rental housing policy being passed, and what are the challenges for it to be implemented? And I've also been looking at a lot of innovations in housing in terms of accessible housing, because we've kind of entered this post-land urbanism where land is either too expensive or there's no land. So there are a lot of interesting examples around the world in terms of infill housing and secondary housing and a lot of community land trust, a lot of different instruments in terms of innovations and entrepreneurship opportunities. So do you see potential and scope for innovation and entrepreneurship in the housing segment?
I think there is this idea to unfreeze FSIs and allow markets to decide. That is one of the methods through which infills may occur. Infrastructure implications of that we don't know, but at least infills may occur to some extent, and some of this is likely to be rental housing. So, but still it's not yet taken off, and then completely opening up the land markets, you might not have ability to buy lands for low income housing. So, and after a limit, the infills can also lead to its extremely high densities and the colony stripping into, I think, slum conditions then. So, when that's okay, I mean, that's no problem, it can get upgraded later on. So we don't know. I think Bangalore, there's a talk of doing it, and because all the master plans, Bombay was that idea and got scrapped, and there's been doing, I have not studied Hyderabad, but Hyderabad, that's what is there in the master plan. So in Bangalore, there was supposed to be, right, the opening up of the FSI part, but we don't know. Rental housing policy, affordable rental, but who's going to provide that? Land prices, I did an exercise, and I'm going to redo that with the new data. It's a data from the real estate companies, and there are some sites that give you city-wise comparison. They give you the data on the value of the house, they give you the data on the rentals of the house, and they give you data on the average income in the city. If you compare them, you find that rentals are as high as 100% of the average income in some cities, even on the periphery. Bombay, they're 200% of the average income on the central parts of the city. Periphery, it's like 70 to 100%. It's not going to work if this is the speculative thing. I don't know whether this demonetization is going to bring out that speculative land markets. We don't know. Because that's it right now. So that's not working out. There's so much of surplus TDR in Mumbai because you need to have demand at these high prices, and that demand is not there in the urban economy. Demand is for rentals of 1,000, 2,000 rupees a month. Demand is for houses which are 5 to 10 lakh rupees. That's very large demand. But affordable housing is 10 lakhs maybe, but many places 15, 20, 25 lakhs. I'll joke with my students that affordable housing is for you, because when you get out of the planning school and get the jobs, this is the kind of housing you're going to be able to afford. And some of them have indeed. Some of our ex-students living in Bombay are living in SRS housing.
That's not a great note to end on, but that's the state of planning and urban crisis in our country. But this was the first of our planning series publics that we've started, and Darshini is going to be here, and you can talk to her after. Thank you a lot. She's been talking non-stop from 2 hours in the class, and immediately after that the public lecture. It's a great honor to have you and engage in this conversation.
I'm happy to be chatting on these issues forever.
Thank you. Thanks all of you.
Thanks for this invitation to all of you.